Let me ask a question before we get started. How many of you have heard or seen on YouTube my initial story of how I transitioned from being a fundamentalist Christian to being an atheist? How many of you have heard that? Okay, so a quarter of you. Would you like me to spend about 10 minutes going through that before I get into this? Okay. Yes. That must have been Carrie. It sounded like her from the back. All right, let me get my time. I grew up in northeast Alabama in a very small rural town. My dad was a Southern Baptist pastor, and our family was extremely conservative. My grandmother used to joke and say that my dad was a hard-shell Baptist, which meant that everything was off limits. Going to Camp Quest to be a counselor, and they were talking about tubing and going in the creek and things, and I had to respond to them and say, I forgot to tell you I don't know how to swim. To which they said, you don't know how to swim? You live in Florida. How is that so? Well, I was never allowed to go swimming, ever, because swimming was mixed bathing. Boys were there, and they could entice me, I could entice them. Some of you who grew up in very conservative traditions have heard this term before, and you know what it's talking about. That's a little bit of the typical life that I had growing up. No pants, no TV, no makeup, no dances. I can't dance, I can't swim. I mean, what good am I? And I have bifocals. This is my life. And unlike a lot of children who grow up in a strict environment, especially with a pastor as a father, they grow pretty wild as they get older. I never did that. I was absolutely so much in love with church, in love with religion. I actually felt at 6 years old that I was called to be a pastor, at which time I was informed that girls aren't allowed to do that. That confused me. But the thought never left me, and instead I went on and started pursuing every way possible that I thought I could fulfill this call that I had on my life. Eventually, it led me to become a school teacher, in a Christian school, of course, a conservative Christian school, because that's where I needed to be. I could teach the good news to these young minds and shape them. We won't get off on that tangent. It was really, there's a few little pieces that I can remember specifically that started my brain working. Now, it's always been a thinking brain. It never shuts off. My older sister tells me that that's my biggest problem, is I can't stop thinking. And she's probably right, actually, if you think, anyway. When I was 7th grade, probably 6th or 7th grade, I was studying the Bible. I was actually teaching some children's classes at the time. I'm pretty sure it was 7th grade. And I came across a passage of Scripture in the book of Corinthians. And this was a passage in the middle of the book where Paul is dealing with the way that church is supposed to be handled. You know, who does what, how you do it, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And the questions about women came up. Well, I'm interested in this, because remember, at 6 years old, I feel like I'm supposed to be in some type of leadership position in a church, but I've been taught that women aren't allowed to do that women are to be submissive to their husbands, to their fathers, to the men in their life. Well, this particular passage of Scripture said the verse that I've always heard, and you probably could say back to me, women be what in church? Be silent in church. I knew that one very well. I followed that one as well as I could. Yet, I noticed on that day that there was another section that said, when a woman prays or prophesies in church with her head uncovered, she dishonors her head. And for whatever reason, probably because my brain never shuts off and I think all the time, my brain snapped and said, wait a minute, those two things don't mean the same thing. Something is wrong here. And I looked and tried to figure it out on my own. I dug in as best I could, and nothing added up, so I went to my dad. I laid out my case before him, and he sat and he thought about it for a few minutes, and he finally looked at me and said, are you confused? Well, duh. Yeah, that's why I came to you. And he gave me some good scriptural advice. He said, God is not the author of confusion. So if you're confused about these things, it's not from God. It's the enemy who's trying to steal your mind. You need to go and confess and pray that God will give you understanding of these things. Because remember, God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So how could we as human beings ever hope to understand the Bible? There's a key there that needs to be mentioned, because I'm 45 now, and I've had folks ask me almost everywhere I go. So I'm going to tell you the answer to this, so don't ask me when you come up to the microphone. I'll tell if you're paying attention or not. They say, how did it take you so long to figure all this out? How could you have been a fundamentalist Christian for the majority of your life? I mean, you say you're a thinker, you appear to be intelligent. I mean, what's the problem? Here's the thing. In the 7th grade, this interchange takes place between me and my father. The message I take away from it is doubt equals lack of faith equals sin. All those questions, all that thinking is wrong. So every time they come up in my mind, I have to go back and I have to confess and I have to pray about it, because God's ways are higher than my ways, and how in the world could I ever expect to understand the Bible? That is the absolute way, as I look back, that I stayed in that place for so long. Because what was my solution to this whole problem? I had to work harder. I had to be a better person. I had to do more things for God. I had to continue to keep myself pure and be pleasing. I mean, how many of you are from religious backgrounds? Does this sound at all familiar to you? Okay. All right. Just want to make sure I don't need to get into a whole theological discussion with you, which I could do. I mean, I've done it for a long time. So I leave from that place and I immerse myself in education. I begin teaching in a Christian school. I mean, we're fast forwarding, to many years in the future. It was while I was teaching in a Christian school that I started to notice a few little things again. For whatever reasons, my brain allowed me to see through the fog. One I was sharing outside with a couple was Pokemon. Okay, that's the title of a book, How Pokemon Helped Me Become an Atheist. Pokemon is a little game, if you're not familiar with it. My kids came home from school, and our church taught us that Pokemon was demonic. Yet, my kids' friends had Pokemon, and their family was a Christian family, and I looked at the game, it's just these little balls. I really didn't understand how it worked, but it was just this little piece of plastic, and they did these little mini battles against each one, and different ones had different powers, and it's almost like rock, paper, scissors, This Pokemon beats this Pokemon, and I get to thinking about it. How can that be disastrous to my kids? How can that tempt them away from God? How can it be demonic? And I didn't have an answer for it, and I didn't question it anymore, because why? Doubt equals lack of faith equals sin. So I just had to move on from that point. Many other things that fed into that, just little things that I noticed as my kids were coming up that were considered evil, but I couldn't find any evil in them at all. So remember those things. Remember, I'm also trying to fulfill in my mind how I can be this Christian pastor that I felt like I'm supposed to be since I was 6 years old. So slowly but surely, I began to drift into a more liberal, into a more liberal state of mind, not realizing what's happening. I feel within myself that I'm simply maturing, that I'm developing my own faith and my own theology as I move away from my dad and from the faith that I was raised in. Well, the truth is I was, but I was definitely moving more to the left, and I became involved in the Methodist Church, went through all the steps, eventually became a pastor. I mean, those things obviously are somewhat evident. And at that point, when I became a Methodist pastor, I was extremely liberal in my theology and was very progressive. Now, you may not believe this, but I had a Methodist church where we started a second service that was geared toward young people. It's called contemporary worship. If you still know about worship and church stuff, you've heard that term before. And I hired a lesbian to be the band leader. Oh my goodness. Talk about catching HE double hockey sticks, as my mom would say. Yeah. So I was extremely progressive, and I was somewhat of a little rebel even at that point. But I was trying to deal with all those things and trying to reconcile, as I had my entire life, how all these pieces could fit together when they seemed to butt up against each other and not make sense in my thinking mind. And the only way that I could comprehend them was to ignore them. During this period of time, I decided that ignoring them is not a good thing. And John Wesley, of all people, helped me with that. John Wesley was very progressive. For those of you who don't know, he was the founder of the Methodist Church. And back in his day, there was a huge famine going on in England. There was corruption in the Church of England. He was a priest in that church, and he noticed certain things about the worship services. Got 7 seconds to finish this up. They would sell certain things to people within the church. Now, this is a fundraising idea for you, Earl, so just consider it, okay? The nobles and those who were wealthy were able to purchase rows. They were able to purchase pews. Those purchased pews, they would decorate. They would put jewels on them. They would have their butler come and serve them tea while the service was taking place. The people who were poor, who, during that day, that would probably be most of us, they had to come in a little bit later. They had to sit all the way in the back because they smelled. And they were beneath all those wealthy people and the noble people. John Wesley was absolutely disgusted at this fact. The fact that the church was bringing in so much money and so many people were starving to death because of this famine that was going on. So he bucked the system, and he would go with his own money, and he would go into the prisons, and he would go into these impoverished areas, and he would take food and he would feed them. This was absolutely revolutionary, and the church couldn't stand it. They couldn't handle that he was becoming popular because he truly cared about people. So guess what? They didn't want him around anymore. In his diary, there's several stories about interchanges with churches. One in particular that I always found very funny was he went to, I think it was St. John's Church. I can't remember the name exactly. And he spoke at their church, and he spoke some of his radical ideas to them about caring for people and helping people. And the deacons asked him afterwards to never, ever come back. I've been asked that before. He couldn't find a place to speak, so he went out in the pasture. He went on the streets, and he tried preaching to the people in the main city town center, and they kicked him out. They ran him off. He went out into a field one time, and some of the folks heard about it, and they turned a bull loose on him. I haven't had a bull turn loose on me yet. Don't get any ideas. So finally, the people that he was caring for, the church word is ministering to, they came and they followed his pattern of thought, and they followed him, Methodism, which was a very, very much steeped in social action. I can remember being a Baptist growing up, my dad telling me that Methodists were demonic because they preached a felt needs gospel, which meant that they actually did go out and do things about people who were hurting and people who were struggling. So John Wesley, your little bitty theology course on Methodist history there, he stirred that part of my imagination. One of the things that he said, and he's most famous for, he said, and it just left me, I hate being 45 years old. Oh my goodness, I'll come back to that. But he talked about how that in everything we can have our agreements, we can have our disagreements, but those should not separate us. Love should be the thing that ties us. That should be the undercurrent of it. So to me, the message I got from it was, as long as I hold to these core tenets of Christian faith, then I'm free to think. I'm free to explore. I'm free to finally delve into all those things that I'd locked up in a dungeon in the back of my mind. And delve in, I did. That thinking brain that would never stop, it didn't stop, definitely. Once it was turned loose, it was like an animal on the hunt. Working through all those things, I'm skipping ahead because I don't want to go over time after this, but this all led up to probably about the last 2 years. I started moving more and more into progressive theology, reading some people that are pretty much ostracized by the Christian church. Rob Bell is one. Brian McLaren is another. They're considered heretics by some because they actually talk about, well, we won't get into that. It's progressive theology. If you want to look into it later, look into it later. But Rob Bell wrote a book called Love Wins, and it was on the theology of hell. I had been dealing with this Bible stuff, and hell was the next place I had to go. I mean, honestly, I needed to go there. He wrote this book as a Christian leader, as a pastor of a 10,000-member church in Detroit, Michigan, and he deconstructed the theology of hell completely. and introduced me to ideas that I hadn't really thought of. The fact that it doesn't exist, that it's not there, that a loving God could not take someone who is only given 72 years, 75 years, 80 years, however many years we have, given very little knowledge, the ability to never understand the scriptures. Remember, I was told we can understand them, and punish them with the most horrendous punishments ever thought of by any human being for failing to understand and accept those things while they're here on this earth. That really unleashed it all for me. I started looking to read people that were no longer in the Christian realm. I read Richard Carrier's book. I read Bart Ehrman. Didn't know who they were. I mean, I just was looking for things. And I guess about a year, well, probably 2 years ago now, I was desperate. One Monday, I was absolutely desperate. I felt like I was losing my mind, that if something didn't happen, I was going to have to check myself into some place so that they could help me, because I just had gone as far as I could go. And I Googled on the internet, wonderful place, a phrase that said, pastors who feel like they're losing their faith. And would you guess who showed up on that search? I'll give you one guess. Book club, next speaker, Clergy Project member, Dan Barker, his book, Godless. I downloaded it onto my Kindle and read it, knowing that I had found a kindred spirit. Forgive the pun. I contacted the address at the end of the book at FFRF. Remember, I know not who this man is. I do not know anything about Freedom from Religion Foundation. I didn't know anything about anything at that point. And he called me back, and we talked for a very long time. And he told me about this brand new thing that was that was happening called the Clergy Project, and invited me to be a part of it. And that, for me, was the most supporting, caring group of people. It still is, because they were right where I was at, or the former ones had been in that place. And I could be open and honest about what I was struggling with and what I was dealing with, and they could post back and say, yes, I'm right there with you. I don't know where to turn. I don't know what to do. Somebody else would come along and say, well, I went through this, and here's how I can help you. You know, we're a bunch of preachers. We always want to help. So there were always people that were posting and saying, let us help you, let us deal with this. That really sealed the deal for me, I guess, because at the very last part of this, don't think, maybe think, I can think, this said, there's no more held sacred. You can think and explore anything in the world that you want to. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. It wasn't really that much longer that I admitted to myself that I had maybe been a polytheist, believing that all religions were equally valid, and I was simply a Christian because I was born in America, to Christian parents, to becoming a deist, where not really thinking that any religion had it right, but God was still the way that the person we were all trying to find, to quickly realizing at this point that I was an agnostic, that I didn't believe there was a God, but I didn't have all the answers either. Remember, I'd spent all my life thinking I had all the answers. So it was kind of hard for me to move into that place. Probably, I hate trying to think of the dates because everything just melds together so much. But eventually, I finally said the big A word. I admitted to myself through a very, very difficult struggle where I literally fought with myself. I had an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. And they would say to me, yes, you do. No, you don't. Yes, you do. No, you don't. Yes, you do. No, you don't. This can't be true. This can't be me. This can't be my life. It was never supposed to be my life. How is this happening? I've got to fix it somehow. To finally moving past that and admitting who I was, what I was, where I was, and accepting the consequences of that, which, if you followed the media at all, you know that they've been pretty serious consequences. I mean, Bill O'Reilly, never again in my life will I accept an invitation from that man. You can send this to him. He's not a nice person. Okay, so that catches you up to where I'm at today and what I'm doing today. I am, because of the way things happened, I've been given a platform. I've been able to stand up and speak for people who are not able to share. Some people who are not even able to come out because of jobs, family, children in school. I mean, especially in the South, it's not always an easy situation. So when I have the opportunity, I go and share my story or share a talk and speak out and hopefully put a nice face on being an atheist. I don't know. At least a face, anyway. I tell jokes, and most of the time people laugh, so that's good. After I'd shared my story for about a year with groups and conferences and people, I was tired of hearing it. I knew it. I lived it. I thought it was all over YouTube. And I knew that I had to move on. I knew that I had to talk about something else. But I thought about what I know and what I'm good at, and it was all about church, leading churches, building churches, theology, community, all these types of things. And it dawned on me one day that everybody's talking about community, how to have community within the free thought movement. The atheist churches in the UK, Jerry DeWitt has a church. He's calling it a church. He has a church in Louisiana. These things are popping up, and people are talking about it more and more and more. And I'm asked about it all the time. So, again, it dawned on me, Eureka moment. You know this stuff. You should talk to groups about this. You need to bring this idea up and foster these relationships with people all across the country. So, that leads me up to the Yellow Brick Road. The Wizard of Oz is probably my most favorite book of all time. Anybody read the book? Okay. Saw the movie? Okay. Love the story, love the movie, love the book. You better raise your hand, I'll ask you to leave. Yeah, that's how it works. You like what the speaker says. So I thought about The Wizard of Oz, and I started to think way too much again, and I thought about the 4 characters that are involved in the story. And I realized that they represent to us the ways that we can build, maintain, and strengthen the communities that we have all around us. Because the reality is, there are many who say, well, why do we need atheist community? Why do we need humanist communities or skeptic communities? Well, we don't need them. We already have them. They already exist. If you have a meetup group, if you have a group like this that gets together and has a social interaction, you already have a community. So the thought then becomes, how do we strengthen it? How do we make it supportive in a way that religious groups do? Religious groups are very good at supporting people in times of need, in times of grief and loss. They're good at celebrating the life cycle events of marriages, birth of children, graduation of students, etc. So the questions that I receive are, why can't we do that as well? Or is it just a religious thing? It's not just a religious thing. Social connection, also known as community, is a human thing. It is what we as human beings are all about, right? What do we call folks who move up into the mountains or into the Appalachians and they don't want to be with anybody and they grow these long beards, and we call them hermits? Are they the norm for our society? No, they're not the norm. Now, if anybody happens to fit in that category, I'm not trying to offend. There's my little disclaimer. But the norm for us is to be attached in some type of social network or some type of social group. Community, at its very base definition, is a social unit that has common values. If you look at it, and you look at it in the Latin text, which I can't speak Latin, so I'm going to save myself the embarrassment. It boils down to 2 words, which means gift and togetherness. So the idea of community is a gift of togetherness. Now, how many of you are married? I know, people tell me, we know you're a preacher because you always ask people to raise their hands. All right, I'm going to try to stop doing that. If you're married, you know that at times it is really a gift to your partner or that you are together, right? I've been married 26 years, and sometimes it's really a gift for me to tolerate my husband. You know, after a few years, when all that warm fuzzies wears off, you start to realize, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? So this social unit sharing common values, this gift of togetherness, is absolutely essential. It's at the core of community building, and it means many things to us. The first thing that it means, according to our fellow here, the Tinman, it means that we have to have a heart. This is the base that all community development, community strengthening has to be structured upon. It means that we actually have to care for each other. That's the gift of togetherness. We have to be willing to see and meet the physical needs of folks. We have to be willing to see and meet financial needs of people, emotional needs. And Richard Hull, who is a good friend of mine, is coming to talk about grief and loss and how do we deal with that. Well, a social structure, a community, intentionally explores these ideas and tries to find ways to support the community as a whole, to support each other during these times. I think this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of folks in the free thought community come to me and come to others, Jerry and Dan and others, is because they don't see this piece being lived out within our communities. They're not sure where to go when they have a loss, when their parent dies or their child dies or a friend dies. If you're in a religious community, you know exactly where to go, right? What's the first phone call you make? You call the pastor, right? Pastor comes over immediately. I've done this so many times. Comes over immediately, talks with the family, calls other family members, shares the bad news to spare the family members that are there, arranges the funeral, goes with them to the service. I mean, continues to care for that family throughout the whole process. And not just the pastor, but the religious community itself. So as as secular and free thought communities, this is something that if we want to have the structure in our groups that we have to start thinking about, showing this caring side of ourselves. This heart piece also tells us that we have to put up with each other. Again, the gift of togetherness. We don't pick on each other. Now, this is a hard one. I mean, some of us, I am one of them, are very fluent in sarcasm. Anybody? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. Okay, I promised I wouldn't do that. We are very fluent in sarcasm, and sarcasm is fun. But you know, sarcasm, it can easily move into being a mean thing, can't it? To where you're picking on somebody, where you're a troll. Now, if you're familiar with Facebook, which I was going to say, Earl, when you were asking how people found out about it, a lot of Facebook folks are here as well. But if you're on Facebook and you happen to post something, people intentionally troll pages to find things that they can irritate and agitate and cause trouble about. When I first came out and I would post something, people would pop on there and say all kinds of bad things about me or other people that were on the page. And I finally learned there's a block feature and I can just get them off my page. But we can't do that within our own circles. This is the principle of kicking them when they're down. We cannot be that way. People have struggles. We have struggles. We always expect people to be so, graceful is the only word that I can think of, to give us so much grace and so much mercy when we're having a difficult time. But when it's you, I'm going to expect you to buck up and get over it. You ever been guilty of that? I've been guilty of that more times than not. Community strengthening, community building requires us to try our best to not be someone who picks on each other, to not be a troll, and to not judge each other. If many of you have been in judging situations where you've been judged, and you've been judged harshly. Some of you, like me, have been judges. Being a judge sets you up on a superior level, and you make a statement subconsciously saying, I have all the answers, and you don't, and you're wrong, and I'm right. Community has to seek to get away from that. Now, these are all ideals. If they were all accomplished right away, then we would have a utopian society. It's not possible to do that. But just because it's not possible doesn't mean that we abandon the idea or we don't try to accomplish it. Our next little fellow we find on the yellow brick road is the Scarecrow. And this was the only brain diagram I could find that wasn't gross and mushy. And since I'm not a gross and mushy person, I didn't want gross and mushy brains up there. How many of you watch Dexter? I chase rabbits. If you watch Dexter, you know that brains are gross and mushy right now, right? Yeah, can't watch that part. The Scarecrow reminds us as community builders and as community leaders that we have to go through a process of discovery. We have to have heart, we have to care for each other, we have to care enough not to send the very best, as Hallmark would say, but to not pick on each other and to be graceful, to be gracious, to be caring to each other. But we also have to go through a period of discovery because each person has something of value. Our community is a lot like some religious communities where there are people who do crazy things and they step up on a stage and they come out publicly and instantly they're asked to go on the news and to speak at conferences and people want to friend them on Facebook and say, oh, I'm friends with Teresa MacBain. No, I am no different than you are. And I am no more important than you are, nor is anybody else within the movement, because social community demands that everybody discover what they have that is valuable and that they offer that to this community. Each person has something to contribute. You may only be someone who is good at social media and you decide you're going to volunteer and you go back there to Carrie, or you come up here to Dave, who is the leader of the North Florida Atheist group, and you say, hey, I want to help you with your Twitter account. Hey, I have somebody with HFA that does that. I love it. I hate Twitter. Don't tell Twitter. Everybody has something of value and everybody has a contribution, and the community has to be a nurturing place where you can discover that. What do you have to offer? What are the needs that exist around you? I had a professor one time who shared something that is not just about religion, it's something that's extremely important. He had us walk out, gave us an assignment to go to our church, walk out on the front steps of the church and look around us and see what it is right in front of the church, right beside the church, right behind the church, and right next door, and focus on those things only. It was groundbreaking for me because I could see things. Sometimes groups get so involved, and churches are good at getting so involved with what's happening in Africa or other places. Not that we shouldn't be a part of that and we shouldn't help that, but when it happens to the neglect of those who are right around us and the needs that are around us, then that's when it becomes a problem. Our social communities need to be those types of communities where we love, we care, we don't pick on each other, we discover what it is, who we are, what we have of value, and what we can contribute, and then we offer it. We understand what the needs are around us, and we offer it to those who are within our group and to people who are without our group. Now, the lion was a big, burly lion who wore a bow in his hair. I never understood why they decided to put a pretty little ribbon in the hair of a male lion. But I guess maybe it just showed that he didn't have enough courage to tell his wife no. No comments on that and no jabbing of the elbows. The lion shows us courage. And in community language, unity is the one thing that takes the most courage. All three of the pieces we've talked about before lead up to this part. Two, I can count. All of the parts, the heart piece, the brains piece, discovering and offering and loving and caring, they lead up to the part of unity, where we actually begin to form together, to unite, to put aside differences in order to achieve the common good. This means that we have to seek common ground. It means that we have to assume the best about each other and give each other the benefit of the doubt. It means that we have to admit we may possibly be wrong. That's a tough one for me. When you've gone through so much to discover who you are, to really dig deep, and then you own it, it brings some confidence with it, doesn't it? I mean, it's difficult, it's a hard journey, but it brings some confidence, and you've done such hard work that you actually know, right? And if you're like me, you can be vocal about it. That's something that as community, we don't want to hinder people from speaking out, but we also want to be listeners, which is our next point. We want to actively listen to the next person, or the person who's talking to us. Have you ever been in a conversation where you're discussing something with someone? Say Earl and I are having a conversation, and the conversation becomes intense, not heated, because we're not debating, we're just talking about some pretty heavy stuff. And instead of listening to what Earl is saying, I immediately start formulating my response that's going to slay him right away in my mind. You ever do that? Yeah, I do that a lot. Community, people who are joined together in this holy matrimony of community, they try their best to be completely engaged in what that person is saying and to listen to them completely and to try their best not to formulate those responses and rebuttals and answers and things in their own head. They actively listen to them. They seek to clarify so there isn't a misunderstanding. They don't storm off saying, well, he said so-and-so or she said so-and-so, when in actuality, they didn't quite mean it that way. They just didn't know how to communicate it very well, which happens to all of us at times. The Lion tells us that it takes an extreme amount of courage to live our lives that way, especially when we're living united in community. Excuse me. The Lion tells us that we don't ever have disagreements. We will have disagreements, and we will probably have a lot of disagreements, but we handle them in a way that shows this community aspect of love and respect. Richard Hull, who is going to be here with you next week, when I was talking to him and fleshing this little talk out a little bit, he said, yeah, you have to agree to be disagreeable. Many of you know that I am married. Well, you do, because I just told you a minute ago. But you may not know that my husband is still a Christian. He is a believer. Trust me, this principle has to be in play in our lives. We have to agree to disagree. Otherwise, it would be constant war at our house. And trust me, that gift of togetherness thing, has to be put into practice. This courage for us to remain united as a husband and wife has to be put in practice. It is one of those principles that we just can't do without if we want to have this thing called community. M. Scott Peck wrote a book called A Different Drum. And in this book, he had this one quote here: there can be no vulnerability without risk. There can be no community without vulnerability. There can be no peace and ultimately no life without community. That really just speaks to me and sums up this entire talk in one little paragraph. Vulnerability. It takes courage. We want this thing. We want to be connected to other people. We don't want to live on an island. We don't want to move into the Appalachians and grow our beards and our long shaggy hair and go out hunting with our bow and arrow or our Hawkins rifle. We want to be connected. It's just extremely difficult, and it requires us to be vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, it means there's a huge risk that people will hurt you. And I'll guarantee you, if you don't hear anything I say besides this, when you open yourself up like that, you're going to get hurt. But you have to be willing for that to happen. You have to be willing, and when the hurt comes, the community needs to exist to support that person. It's just how we are as human beings. I've hurt people. You've hurt people. If you tell me you haven't hurt people, then I'm going to send you to see somebody that deals especially with denial. And denial is not a river in Egypt. We have to be vulnerable to seek this ideal called community. The heroine of our story, Dorothy, tells us that this takes work. And it takes work, and it takes work, and it takes more work, and you're tired of it, and you want to leave the whole thing, and then you have to get back into it, and you have to work and work and work some more. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is not for someone who just wants an easy thing. You know, it's not I better not say that. It'll go out on video, and I'll get somebody emailing me about it. So we'll just skip over that. It takes work. That's the whole point that I'm trying to say. Dorothy also reminds us the things that we've talked about earlier. We have to look away from our own self-centered lives long enough to see the needs of the people who are right around us, to see the needs of the people that we're in community with, and as a community to see the needs of the people who are in the larger community that are around us. In Jacksonville, what are the needs of the people who live in this city? In your own community, maybe you live in Arlington, maybe you live at the beach, out at Jack's Beaches or somewhere. What are the needs? If you stood on your doorstep and you looked around four sides, what would be the needs of the people who are around you? How could you meet those needs? How could this community that you're a part of be a part of that? A good example, the last church I was at, was on the main road, and there was an elementary school that was right across the street from the church. For all the years that the church existed, they'd never thought about going across the road and see if there was any way that they could help the kids. They had gotten caught up in the cycle of, and again, these things are not wrong, but when there's something right in front of you, you need to rethink what your priorities are. They'd got caught up in the cycle of feeding at the soup kitchen, of doing a food pantry or a clothes pantry, which again are good things. But we went over and we talked to the guidance counselor who was over there, and this school serviced an area of town where the kids were mostly single-parent children, where the mom would work 2 jobs, and they had no one to help them with their schoolwork. And because of that, they were failing grades and eventually dropping out of school. So what the church did, we created an initiative just once a week. We didn't have enough people or funds to do any more than that, but we gathered together and had some of those kids come over, and people helped them with reading, people helped them with math problems, science, history, whatever it was that they needed with it. And you know, it was successful. Those kids that we worked with, it was hugely successful. That may not be the case in your own particular community. It's just an example for you to think about, to be innovative, to think outside of the box as you meet those needs. If we're going to make a difference, you know, we all talk about wanting to find a sense of normalcy within society for atheists and humanists and freethinkers, then these are the types of things. We have to be united in a structure of community, and that structure of community has to move us to work. And when those things continue to happen, then people will start to break down those barriers and say, hey, they're nice people. They're doing good things. I need to think about this stuff. Maybe they're not as evil as I thought they were. Maybe they're not immoral. Maybe they're not the devil in disguise, you know, or sometimes not in disguise. Be innovative with these ideas. Look for solutions and remember that they are trial and error. You will fail. Most inventors that are famous folks you think of, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, and others, say that they always learn more from failure than they did from success. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. If it's a huge failure, if it crashes and burns, okay, regroup. Take some notes, you know, sit down and talk about it and try a different approach or try something else. You know, learn from your mistakes. Don't be afraid to try. Community. It requires a heart. We have to care. If you don't have the caring within you for this, then you might as well not start, because the basic bond between us has to be this loving heart and this caring. The brains, we have to discover. We have to create an environment where people can think critically, they can examine themselves, they can understand and discover who they are, what value they have, what they can contribute, and then we have to offer it. We have to be courageous, to stand for peace among us and to stand for unity. And finally, we have to take our hands and put them to work by giving of ourselves, giving within our communities, and working together. You know, just put your shoulder to the grindstone, as my dad would say, and do the work. That's what community is about. And it doesn't matter if it's religious community or secular community or whatever, golf community or football club or fantasy football league or whatever. They're all communities. We as secularists, we as humanists and atheists, we want to have this type of love and compassion and caring and support for each other, so that we can be motivated to accomplish these humanist ideals that we're always talking about. So consider community, consider this gift of togetherness that we've talked about. Thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak to you.